On the first cold morning of November, when the town of Millfield was still waking under a thin silver fog and the streetlights had only just clicked off, people at the Maple Street bus stop noticed the dog again. He came the same way he always came, trotting out from between the alley behind the closed hardware store and the fence line of the church parking lot, head low, shoulders working, dragging a faded blue blanket in his mouth. Stop! Tug! Readjust his grip and keep stop! Tug! Readjust his grip and keep going until he reached the wooden bench by the bus stop sign. Then, with a strange seriousness that made people lower their voices without knowing why, he would spread the blanket as best he could at the base of the bench, circle once, and sit beside it facing the road. The first few times, people laughed softly and took videos. Millfield was a small town, and small-town mornings made room for odd rituals. "Look, he's setting up camp," a teenager joked one Tuesday while waiting for the 6:40 commuter bus to the next city. An older man in a reflective vest who caught the bus to the paper mill every day called him the janitor dog because he looked like he was tidying a place no one else cared about. The driver, Anita Cole, who had run Route 12 for almost 15 years, started keeping dog biscuits in the side compartment because the dog never barked, never jumped, never chased tires, and never acted wild or threatening. He just came with that same blanket, set it in the same spot, and waited. Before we begin, if you enjoy long emotional animal stories with mystery and a twist that changes everything, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what the people of Millfield thought was a strange little habit turned out to be something far deeper, and the truth of who that blanket was for would leave half the town crying at sunrise. The dog was medium-sized, somewhere between a shepherd mix and a collie maybe, with a russet-brown coat gone rough around the ribs and a white patch on his chest shaped almost like a crooked leaf. One ear stood up while the other folded over at the tip. He looked like the kind of dog who had once belonged to someone and then somehow fallen between the cracks of ordinary life. He wore no collar when people first noticed him, and though he was thin, he wasn't in the frantic condition of a fresh stray. He moved like he knew the streets, knew the safe corners, knew which porches to avoid, and which shop owners might toss him scraps. The blanket he dragged was what made him unforgettable. It was old fleece, once bright blue with cartoon stars, now faded and threadbare, one corner torn and stitched badly by hand with yellow thread. He treated it with a care that seemed almost human. If it slipped from his mouth into a puddle, he would pull it to dry pavement before continuing. If someone tried to pick it up to help, he'd take it back gently but firmly and carry it himself. He never let anyone keep it. Anita noticed the pattern before anyone else, because bus drivers notice patterns for a living. Who waits where, who misses on Thursdays, who starts wearing a wrist brace and pretends they're fine, which kids are too quiet, which adults look like they've had bad news but are trying to stand upright through it. The dog began appearing every weekday at almost the exact same time, 6:32, give or take a minute. He'd lay down the blanket by 6:35 and wait until after the 6:40 bus arrived and left. If no one disturbed the blanket, he'd pick it back up around 6:50 and disappear the way he came. On Saturdays, no dog. On Sundays, no dog. Only weekday mornings. "That means it's tied to a person," Anita said one morning to Marlene Pierce, who ran the bakery and waited for deliveries at dawn. Marlene watched the dog smoothing the blanket with his paws and frowned. Or a memory. Anita laughed then, because it sounded poetic and overdramatic for 6:30 in the morning, but the word stuck with her all day. A memory. By the second week, people had named him Blanket. The name spread the way names do in small towns, through coffee lines, group chats, and the Facebook community page where someone posted a blurry video captioned, "Who owns this sweet boy?" Replies multiplied fast. Some people swore he belonged to old Mr. Devlin, who lived near the train tracks and fed every animal in town. Others insisted he was abandoned months ago when renters moved out on Birch. One woman said she had seen a similar dog in summer, with a little girl at the park, but she wasn't sure. A few well-meaning people tried to catch him. Blanket always slipped away before they got close, not panicked, just uninterested. Animal control set a humane trap one evening behind the hardware store after a complaint. But by morning, the trap was untouched, and the dog still appeared at 6:32 with his blue blanket, as if town bureaucracy simply did not apply to him. Anita began stepping off the bus for a minute at the Maple Street stop when she could do so safely. She'd crouch by the steps and speak softly while commuters boarded. "Morning, Blanket." He'd flick his ears, but keep his eyes on the road. She offered biscuits, and he'd take one politely, always carrying it back to the blanket before eating. Never more than one, never taking his focus off the street for long. It was that gaze that eventually unsettled people. He wasn't waiting in the hopeful, random way strays wait near bus stops for dropped food. He was watching for someone specific. Every morning, he tracked each approaching bus with an intensity that made strangers glance over their shoulders to see who might be stepping off. When doors opened, he stood. When feet descended, he searched faces fast, then slower, then sat again. And if no one came, he lowered himself beside the blanket and rested one paw on it like he was keeping something warm. The weather turned colder in the third week. Wind came down from the ridge and rattled the dead sycamore branches over Maple Street. Morning commuters wrapped scarves higher and stamped their feet while waiting. Blanket kept coming. The blue fleece grew wetter, muddier, heavier, and still he dragged it through the fog every dawn and spread it by the bench with careful paws. "To kill me if I don't know," she muttered. "This is going to kill me if I don't know," she muttered. "Know what?" asked Lionel Briggs, retired postmaster and professional eavesdropper, who had recently started taking early walks, mostly to witness the dog ritual. Anita kept her eyes on Blanket. "Who he's waiting for." The answer almost came by accident. It was a Wednesday, bitter cold, the kind of morning when your breath hangs in front of you, and even car engines sound reluctant. Anita pulled the bus up to Maple Street and saw immediately that something was different. Blanket was there with the blanket spread out. Yes, but he was pacing instead of sitting. Tight circles, quick glances down the side street, a soft whine in his throat. Anita opened the bus doors, and the usual handful of commuters climbed aboard, shoulders hunched, coffee cups steaming. Blanket ignored all of them. He stood at the curb, staring past the bus toward the intersection, then darted back to the blanket, then to the curb again. "He's upset," Marlene said quietly from the sidewalk, flour still dusting the sleeve of her coat. Anita checked the mirror, checked the time, and made a decision bus drivers aren't really supposed to make. She left the bus idling, set the brake, and stepped down. "Blanket?" she said softly. The dog spun toward her and gave a short, sharp bark, his first bark anyone there had heard. Then he grabbed the edge of the blue blanket and dragged it farther from the bench, closer to the curb. Not random, deliberate. He dropped it, looked up at Anita, and barked again. "Okay," Anita whispered, heart beginning to race. "What is it?" Then they heard the cough. It came from the church side of the bus stop, near the low hedge bordering the parking lot. Not a healthy throat clear. A deep, tearing, exhausted cough, followed by a weak groan. Marlene's hand flew to her chest. Anita moved fast around the bus stop bench and saw, half hidden behind the hedge where the shadows were thickest, a man collapsed on the ground. He was elderly, bundled in a thin coat, one arm curled awkwardly beneath him. His skin looked gray in the dawn light. Beside him in the leaves was a metal cane. For one stunned second, Anita didn't process the face. Then she did. "Mr. Talbot!" she shouted, dropping to her knees. Harold Talbot was 78, a widower who lived 3 blocks away and took the 6:40 bus to the dialysis center in the next town every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Quiet man, always exact fare, always a pressed cap, and a thank you for the driver. Anita hadn't seen him board in over 2 weeks and assumed, as everyone did in busy small towns, that his son was driving him now, or his appointment schedule had changed. Mr. Talbot's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. He was shivering violently. One leg was twisted under him, and his right glove lay several feet away like he had reached for it and failed. Blanket pushed in close, whining, pressing his body against the man's side. The blue blanket, now dragged beside them, was muddy and damp, but clearly familiar. Anita looked from the dog to the old man, and the pieces slammed together so hard she felt dizzy. This dog wasn't using the bus stop as a camp. He had been bringing the blanket back to the place where Harold Talbot had fallen. Every weekday, the exact days Harold used to take the bus, waiting for him to come out of the hedge and stand up and board like always. Anita barked orders with a clarity that came from training and adrenaline. "Marlene, call 911 now. Lionel, get my emergency kit from the front compartment. Somebody keep the passengers inside. We may be delayed." Commuters poured off the bus anyway, concern overriding schedule, but to Millfield's credit, nobody crowded. They formed a loose circle shielding the hedge from wind while Anita checked Harold's breathing and tried to keep him responsive. He was conscious, barely, cold to the bone, weak pulse. "Harold, can you hear me? It's Anita. Stay with me." His eyes fluttered. "Tried. Bus," he whispered, each word a scrape. "Fell. Couldn't." Blanket licked his hand frantically, then lay half across his legs as if trying to give warmth. Lionel returned with the emergency blanket from the bus first aid kit, and together Anita and Marlene covered Harold while they waited for the ambulance. Nora? Wait. No, this wasn't Nora. Anita caught herself mentally because her whole world had narrowed to breath counts and keeping Harold awake. The paramedics arrived within minutes that felt like an hour. They assessed Harold quickly and loaded him into the ambulance for severe hypothermia, dehydration, and what later turned out to be a fractured hip from the fall. The lead paramedic looked at the dog and said, "Is this his?" Anita answered without hesitation. "Yes. I think so. He's the reason we found him." Blanket tried to climb into the ambulance after Harold, whining, paws on the step, but a paramedic gently blocked him. Harold stirred enough to see the dog and weakly lifted his hand an inch. "Blue," he rasped. "Don't. Leave Blue." Anita crouched, tears burning unexpectedly. "We won't," she said. "I promise." That was how the town learned the dog's real name. Blue, not Blanket. Blue Talbot, 13 years old, adopted as a pup after Harold's wife died, named for the blanket he chewed to pieces, his first week home, and later slept on every night beside Harold's armchair. Over the next 24 hours, the rest of the story came out in fragments from hospital staff, Harold's son in Raleigh, and neighbors who suddenly realized they'd each been holding one small piece of a bigger truth. Harold had been too proud to ask for much help. After a bad fall in summer, his mobility worsened. He stopped walking Blue as far, but every dialysis morning Blue still accompanied him to the Maple Street bus stop and waited by the bench until Harold boarded, then walked home carrying that old blue blanket because Harold used to spread it under the bench in winter so Blue wouldn't lie on cold concrete. 2 weeks earlier, before dawn, Harold had tried to make the bus alone after a night of dizziness and fallen behind the church hedge. He couldn't get up. He had his phone, but it had slipped beyond reach when he hit the ground. He shouted until his voice gave out. Somehow, in the confusion and dark, he managed to unclip Blue's leash and push the dog toward the street, maybe hoping someone would notice. Blue ran back and forth between Harold and the bus stop as the first bus came and went in darkness and fog. No one heard. No one looked behind the hedge. By the time daylight strengthened, a church volunteer arriving early had found Harold and called emergency services. But by then, Blue had been taken home by a neighbor who assumed Harold had just had another rough morning. Harold survived that first collapse and spent days in the hospital, but when he was discharged briefly to a rehab unit out of town, Blue escaped the neighbor's yard and returned to Maple Street the next weekday at exactly the old bus time, dragging the blue blanket back to the bench and then to the hedge, waiting for Harold to come. No one knew because no one knew what they were seeing. They saw a strange dog ritual. They did not see a dog reenacting the morning his person disappeared. Anita sat in her kitchen that night with her root log untouched and cried harder than she had in years. Not only because Harold could have died that Wednesday if Blue hadn't escalated, pacing and barking and dragging the blanket to the curb, where people finally paid attention, but because she had watched that dog every morning and missed the meaning until the emergency forced it into focus. Decided not to put up, because it felt too decided not to put up, because it felt too much like turning grief into a festival. Anita came early off duty. Marlene brought bacon scraps and then put them away when Jenna from Animal Control, who had heard the story and offered to help, explained they needed to keep Blue calm, not overstimulated. They didn't know if he would come. At 6:33, he did. The crowd, body tense. Anita stepped the crowd, body tense. Anita stepped forward alone, crouched, and held out her hand. "Morning, Blue?" He stared at her, then looked to the bench, then to the hedge, and gave a low whine. Anita's throat tightened. She took a breath and did something impulsive and perfect. She spread a clean, dry fleece blanket beside the old blue one, then sat on the cold pavement near the bench and waited. After a long minute, Blue came to her. Not all the way, just enough to set the old blanket down between them. Jenna eased a slip lead over his neck, while Anita fed him tiny pieces of biscuit. Blue trembled, but did not fight. "Easy, buddy," Anita whispered. "We know now. We know." Harold spent 9 days in the hospital and then transferred to a rehabilitation center closer to town. His son, Michael, arrived looking like a man carrying too much guilt in too few hours. He had tried to get Harold to move in with him for years. Harold had always refused. "Stubborn old man," Michael said, voice breaking at the hospital room door. "Stubborn dog too, apparently." When Anita and Jenna brought Blue to visit for the first time, the nurse warned them not to expect too much, because Harold was weak, on oxygen, and drifting in and out. Blue entered the room slowly, sniffed the antiseptic air, then froze when he saw the bed. The old dog made a sound so soft and raw that Anita turned away immediately to hide tears. Harold opened his eyes at the sound. For a heartbeat, he looked confused. Then he saw the blue blanket folded at the foot of the bed and the dog beside it, and his whole face changed. "Blue boy," he whispered. Blue put his front paws carefully on the mattress edge and rested his chin by Harold's hand, and the room went silent except for the oxygen machine and Michael crying openly in the corner. Harold recovered enough over the next month to return home with round-the-clock support arranged by a combination of family, church volunteers, and more neighbors than anyone expected. A ramp was built in one weekend. Meals were organized. Anita changed her route break once a week to stop by for coffee. Marlene sent bread by accident every Friday. And Maple Street bus stop got a small metal plaque on the bench after the town council, usually allergic to sentiment, unanimously approved it. It read, "In honor of Blue, who waited and made us look twice." Blue never dragged the blanket to the bus stop again after Harold came home. For a few weeks he still walked there with Michael, or a volunteer, and sat by the bench for a minute, watching the road, then turned back when called. Gradually, even that stopped. He preferred the front porch after that, especially when sunlight hit the boards in the afternoon, and Harold sat bundled in a quilt with a cane across his knees and one hand always resting on a familiar blue fleece. The old blanket was washed, mended again, and retired from dragging duty, though Blue still slept on it every night. What remained in Millfield long after the frost thawed and buses ran full into spring was not just the story of a clever dog, but the uncomfortable and beautiful lesson tucked inside it. Everyone had seen Blue doing the same impossible thing over and over, and everyone had made up a harmless explanation, because harmless explanations are easier than asking what pain might be hiding in plain sight. Anita would tell that part whenever newcomers asked about the plaque. She'd lean on the bus door and say, "He wasn't being strange, he was being faithful. We were the slow ones." And on certain cold mornings, when fog hung low over Maple Street and the bench looked for 1 second exactly as it had that November, people waiting for the 6:40 still found themselves glancing toward the alley, half expecting to see a russet dog trotting out with a blue blanket in his mouth, coming once again to prepare a place at the stop for the person he loved, and refusing, day after day, to leave until somebody finally understood who it was for.